On a foggy spring morning in 1996, 10-year-old Daniel Whitmore and his 8-year-old sister Megan left their front yard and walked to the end of Hollow Creek Road to catch their school bus. They never made it. Despite weeks of searching, no trace of the children was ever found until 28 years later, when a storm uprooted a tree deep in the woods. What was tangled in its roots would blow the case wide open and expose a secret the town of Elmridge had buried for far too long. The fog came in heavy that morning, April 9, 1996, coating the quiet streets of Elmridge, Pennsylvania, in a thick gray hush. The birds were silent. The grass still clung to last night's dew, and every branch along Hollow Creek Road seemed motionless under the weight of the mist. Daniel Whitmore, 10 years old, zipped his coat to the top and nudged his sister Megan, who was crouched at the edge of the driveway picking a dandelion. "Come on," he said, adjusting the strap on his backpack. "We'll miss the bus." Megan, 8 and tiny for her age, stood and tucked the flower behind her ear. "Do you think Mrs. Hadley will really bring her guinea pigs today?" she asked, brushing mud from her shoes as they started the short walk to the end of the road. Daniel shrugged. If she remembered. They'd walked that half-mile stretch 100 times. Past the miller's white picket fence. Past the hollow log near the mailboxes where squirrels liked to hide. It was a quiet street, safe, the kind of neighborhood where parents watched from porches and kids played until the streetlights blinked on. But that morning no one saw what happened. At 7:46 a.m., their neighbor Mrs. Parsons, who always drank her coffee at the kitchen window, glanced toward the road and noted the children were there, 2 small shapes standing by the rusted yellow bus sign. At 8:04 a.m., when the school bus came rattling up Hollow Creek Road, the spot was empty. No Daniel, no Megan. The driver, Mr. Kramer, figured he was early. He waited an extra minute, then continued on. It wasn't until 9:15 a.m. when the school secretary called Mrs. Whitmore about the children's unexplained absence that the panic began. Lisa Whitmore dropped the phone. She ran down the street in her slippers, calling their names. Patrick Whitmore searched the woods behind the house, tripping over brambles and roots in his rush. No sign of the kids. No footprints. Not even a forgotten lunchbox. Police arrived within the hour. By noon, the street was swarmed with search dogs, volunteers, and reporters. Flashlights cut through the fog rakes, scraped through brush, and everyone called the children's names again and again. But the woods remained still. As dusk fell, the cold returned. Lisa sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, refusing to move. Patrick hadn't come back yet. He'd taken a flashlight and kept walking into the woods, convinced he could find something the others had missed. They never found a footprint. No scrap of clothing. No tire tracks. Just silence. Over the next 48 hours, Elmridge transformed. Helicopters hovered low, deputies scoured ponds, and news crews rolled in from Pittsburgh. Flyers with Daniel and Megan's faces were taped to every pole pinned in grocery stores and passed from hand to hand. Some suggested the children had run away, but nobody believed that. They loved their school. They had friends. Daniel was excited for the spelling bee. Megan never missed a Tuesday library visit. Then came the whispers. A drifter seen near the edge of town. A rust-colored pickup speeding away that morning. Someone claimed they heard a scream. Someone else said they saw a man in camouflage near the tree line. None of it stuck. None of it helped. By the end of the week, the search had expanded 30 miles in every direction. Still nothing. On day 8, the town held a candlelight vigil in the church courtyard. Lisa Whitmore didn't speak. She just clutched 2 small candles, one in each hand, and stared at the horizon like she was waiting for the fog to lift and her children to reappear. That never happened. By the 3rd week, search efforts slowed. Reporters left. Volunteers returned to their jobs. Police moved on to newer cases. The Whitmore family was left with nothing but theories, empty bedrooms, and the aching question that would follow them for decades. How do two children vanish in the middle of a quiet road with no one seeing a thing? By the time summer arrived in Elmridge, the energy that had once electrified the search turned heavy and strange. The bright banners with "Bring Daniel and Megan Home" faded in the sun, their corners curling and tearing in the breeze. What had been a town united by urgency was now divided by suspicion. The Whitmores found themselves at the center of it. Initially, the community's support had been unwavering meals left on the porch lawn signs, volunteers who combed the woods for days. But when no suspects were arrested, no leads confirmed, the questions turned inward. Whispers began in line at the pharmacy, at the church bake sale behind closed doors. The parents were asked to take polygraph tests. They both agreed. Lisa passed. Patrick's results were inconclusive. That word, inconclusive, was enough to infect everything. Reporters picked it up. Neighbors repeated it like scripture. Some speculated he had a temper. Others said he always seemed distant, the quiet type. Even the way he avoided interviews was viewed as suspicious. Lisa felt it first. The isolation. Once friendly smiles curdled into wary glances. Friends stopped calling. Mothers avoided her in the grocery store aisle. And then came the letters, typed unsigned, cruel. "You know more than you're saying. Maybe check the basement again. It was your husband, wasn't it?" Lisa began sleeping with the lights on. Patrick stopped going into town altogether. Police had nothing to charge anyone with. They questioned relatives, teachers, the bus driver, even a former babysitter with a petty theft charge. Nothing turned up. The case file thickened, and still no bodies. No items recovered. Not a single fingerprint or shred of clothing. Without evidence, there was no crime scene. Without a crime scene, there was no arrest. The stress cracked the marriage open like ice under weight. Arguments spilled from the living room into the neighborhood. Patrick insisted someone had taken the children, maybe a stranger passing through, maybe someone from the woods. Lisa accused him of giving up too quickly. By the first anniversary of the disappearance, Patrick moved out. Lisa stayed in the house, sleeping in the kids' room some nights, unable to part with their belongings. Their beds remained made. Megan's stuffed bear still sat upright on her pillow. Daniel's school project about astronauts, finished the night before they vanished, stayed taped to the refrigerator. Meanwhile, the town kept breathing slowly, returning to normal. The school erected a small plaque in memory of the twins. New teachers were hired. Streets were repaved. A new family moved into the house at the end of Hollow Creek Road. And in time, Elmridge did what so many towns do when tragedy leaves no answer. It turned its attention elsewhere, but the file remained open. Tucked into a locked drawer at the Elmridge Police Department, its label fraying from years of being handled, Whitmore, Daniel, and Megan, missing persons, 1996. Over the years, tips trickled in like rain hitting a roof. A woman in Ohio claimed she saw Daniel at a gas station. A psychic in Vermont insisted she'd seen the children buried near water. A retired trucker swore he picked up a boy and girl on the interstate who looked off. All were investigated. None led anywhere. The one rumor that stuck, however, came from the edge of the woods. Locals began to mention a man they called Old Branford, who lived in a shack deep in the forest north of Hollow Creek. He was said to be harmless, a recluse, possibly a veteran with a wild beard and a bad limp. Kids dared each other to run near his property, claiming he had cameras in the trees and kept watch with binoculars. In truth, very few had actually seen him. During the original search, a deputy named Harlan Pierce visited the shack. It had been empty. Branford was reportedly out hunting, and when he returned weeks later, he claimed to know nothing about the children. Pierce's notes indicated nothing suspicious was found, and Branford wasn't questioned further. But as years passed, stories grew darker. One child said he saw bones behind the shack. A hunter claimed he heard screams echoing from the valley nearby. A former classmate of Daniel's even recalled that Branford had once offered the kids candy as they passed. Still, no one followed up. Branford died in 2008. His property was left to rot, overrun with vines and silence. By 2016, the Whitmore twins were no longer discussed in Elmridge, not publicly. Just the occasional name drop at a bar, a quiet shake of the head at the town diner. Sad business, someone might say. Still no answers. And then, in the spring of 2024, after 2 straight weeks of rain, a large oak tree near the northern edge of the forest cracked at its base and toppled during the night. The next morning, a hiker passing through the trail spotted something tangled in the roots. 2 small backpacks. Moldy, weather-worn, faded, but unmistakably child-sized. And on one of them, barely visible beneath the grime, a name written in fading Sharpie. Monsieur Whitmore. The moment the Elmridge Police Department received the hiker's call, it was like a switch flipped, something old and dusty grinding back to life. Sergeant Renee Harwood was on duty when dispatch radioed in the report. By the time she reached the trailhead at North Hollow Preserve, emergency tape was already being strung between leaning pine trunks. The fallen tree, a white oak estimated to be over a century old, lay cracked in 2 at the edge of a gully. Rain-soaked earth had pulled up part of its root system, revealing a twisted web of roots, rocks, and something entirely out of place. The backpacks. Harwood crouched low as a crime scene technician carefully lifted them with gloved hands. They were fragile, partially eaten by insects, zippers, rusted seams unraveling, but they were still whole enough to be unmistakably recognizable. Bright colors dulled by time. Cartoon patches peeling off. Faint outlines of initials. And then came the moment no one could ignore. Inside one pack, wrapped in a decayed Ziploc bag, was a laminated bus pass with a date stamp April 1996. The photo, slightly blurred from condensation, showed a gap-toothed boy smiling shyly at the camera. The name beneath it, Daniel Whitmore. Harwood stood slowly, her heart in her throat. Get forensics down here now. Within hours, the woods were a flurry of movement. Bright floodlights turned the clearing into a surreal stage. Equipment buzzed, radios crackled, and specialists with gentle precision worked to preserve every detail. Beneath the root ball, they unearthed a second discovery: bones. Small, human, fragments at first, then more. DNA tests would take time, but everyone already knew. The Whitmore children had been found, or at least part of them. By sunset, news vans were back in town. Elmridge hadn't seen this kind of attention in over 2 decades. Reporters and windbreakers stood outside the town library, reciting updates into cameras, while locals passed by wide-eyed and quiet. Inside her home, Lisa Whitmore watched the coverage in silence. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the volume. The reporter said it was a significant break in the longest-running missing child case in Pennsylvania state history. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "I knew it. I knew they didn't leave." When detectives interviewed her the next morning, Lisa was sharper than they expected. Time had aged her, yes. Her hair grayer, her frame thinner, but her memory was still vivid. She recounted every detail of that day in 1996, nearly word for word. The breakfasts they ate, the shoes they wore, Daniel's blue spiral notebook and Megan's plastic hair clips. She asked just one question. Was there anything in the bags? Sergeant Harwood hesitated. A few personal items, she said. And one thing that doesn't match. It was a key, old bronze, unmarked. It didn't belong to the Whitmore family. Lisa confirmed that immediately. It wasn't for their home, their garage, or any place she could recognize. And it was tucked deep into Megan's backpack, wrapped inside a cloth pouch. That detail nagged at Harwood. It didn't feel random. The forensic team returned to the site over the following days. Beneath layers of soil near the roots, they discovered what looked like an animal den that had long since collapsed. Bones of small woodland creatures, decomposed leaves, and loose brick fragments filled the cavity. No additional human remains were recovered, but then came another strange find, a pair of eyeglasses, wire-framed, thick-lensed, the right temple broken. They didn't belong to either child. Cross-referenced against missing persons in the area, they turned up nothing. Until a retired officer named Gene Wallace, reviewing the evidence from his cabin, muttered a name no one had spoken in years. Branford. A collective pause spread through the department. "You mean old Branford?" someone asked. "The hermit in the woods." Wallace nodded. "He had a limp, wore glasses, same style, but he was cleared," another detective said. "No," Wallace corrected. "He was never charged." "That's different." The department pulled Branford's old file. Thin. 2 pages. A report from Deputy Pierce noting a visit to the man's shack in 1996. No suspicious findings, no follow-up. But now suddenly his shack, long since collapsed, was less than a mile from the tree where the backpacks were found. The team returned to the area. The shack's remains were hardly more than a scattering of rotted boards and rusted hinges, half buried under leaves and moss. But beneath a section of collapsed flooring, they found something else, a rusted ladder leading down into a shallow pit. It was no more than 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide, likely a root cellar at one point. The floor was earthen. The air was damp and stale. Along one wall was a cluster of old objects, broken jars, a child's mitten, the remnants of a sleeping mat. Then, near the corner, Sergeant Harwood found a brick fragment bearing initials faintly scratched into its surface. D.W. Daniel Whitmore. She stepped back, heart pounding. The pit was now a crime scene. Again, the forensic team was called in. Cameras flashed. Samples were bagged. A perimeter was set. Harwood radioed the station. "We're going to need everything on Branford," she said. "Old addresses, known associates, construction permits. I want to know if this man ever had reason to dig holes in the ground." And then she paused. "And find out if anyone in this town helped him." The name Branford echoed across Elmridge like a ghost, long thought buried. For most residents under 30, he was just a campfire story. The man in the woods' parents used to keep kids from wandering too far. For those older, though, the name carried weight, unease, regret. A silent understanding that maybe they hadn't looked close enough. Maybe they hadn't wanted to. Sergeant Harwood sat at her desk, staring at the faded mugshot of Walter Branford, dated 1979. The photo showed a man in his early 50s, expression blank eyes clouded by thick lenses. His file was thin, very thin. A trespassing charge in 72, a psychiatric hold in 75, after making vague threats toward city officials, and a series of complaints about loitering, indecent muttering, and feeding animals out of garbage bins behind the elementary school, but never anything violent, never anything that stuck, until now. Harwood rubbed her eyes. Why didn't they dig deeper back then? Detective Joel Marston dropped a newer file onto her desk. Because no one wanted to accuse the town's weird guy unless they had to. Branford was convenient to ignore. Inside the folder were grainy photos of the pit site, a digital scan of the engraved brick, and a forensic report confirming that the pair of eyeglasses matched Branford's prescription from a Veterans Affairs clinic in 1993. "But he's dead," Marston added. "Died in '08. Natural causes. Buried in the county plot." Harwood nodded. "So maybe he took the secret with him. Or maybe she tapped the key found in Megan's backpack. Someone else was part of this." They focused next on the key. A local locksmith examined it carefully and determined it belonged to a very specific type of padlock used in the early 1980s, commercial-grade, common in schools and storage units. The serial number had long worn off, but the design wasn't random. With help from the town's building department, they cross-referenced old-school blueprints and utility maps. That's when they stumbled upon something strange. An orchard, specifically the Hollow Orchard campus, an auxiliary building once used by Elmridge Elementary School in the 1970s and 80s. It had closed in 1992 due to asbestos concerns and budget cuts. But before that, it had served as storage maintenance headquarters and occasionally overflow classroom space. Guess who had worked there? Walter Branford, a part-time janitor, employed on and off for nearly 12 years. The orchard was now private property owned by a reclusive man named Franklin Latch, who had purchased the parcel at auction shortly after the school decommissioned the building. He'd never torn it down, just let nature swallow it. When officers approached the property, Latch was cooperative but bewildered. "I've never even been inside," he said. "Bought it for the land. Planned to plant trees. Didn't happen." They walked through the rotted exterior of the old building. The windows were broken. Graffiti scrawled across the walls. The floors sagged underfoot. Rats scattered at the sound of footsteps. But what caught Harwood's attention was the basement. A metal door, heavy, locked from the outside with a padlock. It matched the key. Her hands were steady as she slid the bronze key into the lock. It clicked open with surprising ease, like the lock had been oiled recently. Inside, a short staircase descended into darkness. The air was sour, cold, silent. They descended with flashlights, breathing shallowly. The basement was mostly empty old desks, metal filing cabinets, a broken mop bucket. But one wall had clearly been tampered with. The cinder blocks had different coloring. Newer mortar. A seam. "Get me ground-penetrating radar," Harwood said. By the next morning, the team had mapped a hollow space behind the wall. They drilled carefully. When the block gave way, the flashlight beams revealed a hidden chamber no larger than a walk-in closet. And inside, old furniture, a mattress, rotted blankets, a child's bracelet with pink beads. On the far wall, someone had drawn a picture charcoal on concrete. 2 stick figures on bikes, a crude bus in the background, trees surrounding everything, and beneath the drawing, a single line of text. "We were here." Forensics flooded the site. Soil samples were taken. Hair was found embedded in the bedding. DNA tests were ordered immediately. But what they found next made everyone stop. Tucked into the back of a cracked desk drawer, a letter, yellowed, folded many times, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was tight, slanted, erratic. The letter began, "I didn't want to be part of it. I never meant to hurt them. I was told just to keep them quiet just for a while. But then the man never came back. I couldn't let them go. I couldn't face what I'd done." Harwood felt her stomach twist. The letter wasn't from Branford. It was from someone else. Someone still living, someone local. Someone who hadn't planned to confess but had written this maybe as insurance. Or guilt. Or both. Marston leaned over her shoulder. "You thinkin' what I'm thinking?" She nodded slowly. "We were never just looking for a lone wolf." The handwriting was shaky, but deliberate, each word, a nervous confession, carefully carved in ink. Harwood and Marston stared at the letter, its paper trembling slightly in the detective's gloved grip, as if it still carried the vibrations of a conscience rattled by decades of silence. "The man never came back," the letter had read. "I didn't know what to do. They cried every day. I brought them food, but it wasn't enough. I thought someone would come. They didn't. I was too scared to speak." The letter was unsigned, but Marston had already lifted it into an evidence bag and passed it to forensics. The ink would be analyzed, the pressure patterns reviewed, and the sheet would be cross-checked against writing samples from school employees, local parole records, and past town staff. But the letter alone wasn't enough. They needed a name. Harwood pulled old employment records from the Hollow Orchard files, anything mentioning janitorial or maintenance hires, temporary volunteers, or faculty assigned to that building in the 1980s or early 90s. That's when a name reappeared, one that hadn't been on their radar in years: Ernest Ernie Brome. He'd been hired as a part-time custodian in 1990, worked 4 days a week. Quiet, clean record. Left in 1992 just before the building was shuttered. The file listed a forwarding address in another county, but a quick DMV check showed he hadn't left the area. In fact, he still lived in Elmridge in a modest ranch home only 2 miles from the Orchard ruins. They decided not to wait. Harwood and Marston drove to his home under cover of early evening. The lights were on. A garden hose stretched across the yard. Wind chimes clinked softly under the porch eave. It was a picture of rural tranquility. Ernie answered the door in a stained flannel shirt and slippers. He was in his late 60s now, heavy-set with watery eyes and a voice that cracked when he greeted them. "You folks from the station?" he asked. "Yes," Harwood said, flipping her badge. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" He blinked. "Something happened." "Yes," Marston said. "Something old happened. We're looking back at the Whitmore case." The name hit like a physical blow. Ernie's hands twitched, grasping the edge of the door. "The children," he said quietly. They still missing." Harwood locked eyes with him. "We found their backpacks." Ernie went pale. He stepped back wordlessly and let them in. The interior of the home was modest. Dusty. Quiet. Harwood's eyes scanned every shelf, every surface. Pictures of a woman now likely deceased hung near the kitchen. A crocheted blanket covered the back of an armchair. "You worked at Hollow Orchard in the early 90s, Marston said. "You remember that?" "Yes, sir. You worked alongside Walter Branford." He hesitated. "Some. Not often. He was mostly on the night crew. Did you ever speak with him outside of work?" Ernie looked down at his hands. "A couple times. He was strange." Harwood leaned forward. "Did you know there was a sealed room in the basement?" He looked up, eyes wide. "What room?" "The one where someone left a note. Someone who said, 'The man never came back.'" "Was that you, Mr. Brome?" Ernie's shoulders slumped. His breath caught in his throat. "Then I didn't hurt them." Harwood stayed still. "Then tell us what you did." Ernie rose and shuffled toward a hallway. For a tense second, Marston moved to block him, but the man only opened a closet door and pulled out an old shoebox. He returned and set it on the table between them. Inside were objects that sent shivers down Harwood's spine. A child's mitten, a hair clip purple with a chipped ladybug decal, an elementary school class photo with 2 small faces circled in red. "I kept these," Ernie whispered. "I wanted to go to the police. I tried to write a letter. I didn't know how to explain." Harwood reached into the box and lifted the letter. The handwriting matched. He began to talk. In 1996, Ernie had still occasionally checked on the Hollow Orchard building. Though technically retired, he was trusted with a spare key. He used it sometimes to store tools, sometimes to drink, sometimes just to be alone. One night, he found Branford and the 2 children in the hidden basement. "He told me they were just resting," Ernie said. "Said they'd be moved soon. But they looked scared." Megan was crying. Daniel tried to speak, but Branford snapped at him. He paused, wringing his hands. "I brought them food the next day. Branford wasn't there. He never came back. I didn't know what to do." Harwood's voice was steady. "You could have called for help. I thought I'd go to jail. Thought no one would believe me. I boarded the door, left the key inside. And the children, I kept bringing food for 2 weeks," he said, his voice cracking. "One day they were just gone." Marston frowned. "Gone how?" "I opened the door and they weren't there. The blankets were folded. A note left behind said, 'We're going home.' That's all. I thought maybe they escaped. Maybe they found a way out." Harwood narrowed her eyes. "Why didn't you say anything?" Tears now. "Because part of me thought I wanted to believe they were safe, that they'd run away, that they weren't dead. And if they were, I was responsible too." Harwood stood. "You're coming with us." As they escorted Ernie Brome out of the house, the town of Elmridge watched in silence. Some people peered through blinds. Others stepped out onto porches, recognizing the man who had lived among them for decades, quiet and unassuming. They had no idea he was the key to the town's deepest wound. Ernie Brome sat in the dim interrogation room of the Elmridge Police Department, staring at the table with red-rimmed eyes and trembling fingers. A half-empty paper cup of water sat untouched beside him. Harwood and Marston watched him through the two-way mirror, their expressions grave. "He's not the monster," Marston said softly. "But he's part of it." Harwood nodded. "He buried the truth intentionally, or not." She stepped into the room, closed the door quietly, and sat across from him. "We need everything, Ernie. Start from the beginning." Ernie exhaled slowly. "It was mid-March 1996. I'd just lost my wife. My drinking got worse. I'd go out to the orchard at night to get away from people. I had my own key to the basement. No one else ever went down there since the asbestos report." He paused, voice cracking. "I didn't even know Branford was using it until I saw the candlelight through the old supply room grate. That's when I went down and found them." Harwood leaned forward. "What were they doing?" "Tied up, but not hurt. Not then." He blinked slowly. "Branford said he was just holding them for someone. Told me not to get involved, and you didn't call anyone. I was afraid." His voice was almost a whisper. "He said they were being moved across the border, that it was temporary. He even talked like it was a favor to someone higher up, like there was more to it." That thread hung in the air between them. Harwood seized it. "Who? What do you mean, someone higher up?" Ernie shook his head. "He never named names. Just said he was a caretaker, not the boss. And the kids, he talked about them like they were property." Harwood's jaw tensed. "Did you ever see anyone else come or go?" "One man," Ernie said after a pause. "Once. Drove a green pickup. Dropped something off in a duffel bag. Never saw his face. And the night the children disappeared." Ernie wiped his face with both hands. "I went down like usual. This time the hatch was ajar. Inside, the blankets were neatly folded. Their shoes were gone. On the wall they'd scrawled, 'We're going home.' I thought they'd gotten away somehow." Harwood sat back in silence. Then she asked, "Why keep the items? The mitten, the clip, the photo?" He looked up. "Because I couldn't forget them." DNA tests confirmed what everyone feared. The remains found near the oak tree belonged to Megan Whitmore. The backpack and items had protected her bones from total decomposition, but only partial remains were recovered. Daniel's DNA was not among them. That revelation reopened every theory. Had Daniel escaped? Was he taken elsewhere? Why leave Megan behind? Or was it the other way around? Was he the one buried and Megan taken? It forced investigators to reconsider everything. They returned to the collapsed shack site, this time with a cadaver dog team. While the original pit had been processed, no one had thoroughly searched the surrounding land due to the unstable terrain and rain. 2 days later, just beyond a tree line 40 yards north of the shack, a new discovery emerged. A shallow depression in the earth, covered with rocks, disturbed soil. Digging revealed a child's sneaker. Faded. Blue canvas. Size 3. Underneath it, a second set of remains. Dental records later confirmed them as Daniel Whitmore. The final puzzle piece clicked into place, not in a courtroom, not in an interrogation room, but under a canopy of trees that had silently guarded their secret for 28 years. Still, one piece remained unsolved: the green pickup truck. The unknown man. A forensic technician revisiting the orchard site uncovered a rusted license plate behind the furnace in the basement. A partial number, 37CL, was legible. It was just enough for DMV records to track. The plate was linked to a 1979 Chevrolet C10 registered to a man named Glenn Dorsey. a former groundskeeper for the school district who retired in 1996 and moved 2 towns over. Harwood and Marston paid him a visit. He was 78 now, wheelchair-bound, living in a care home. At first, he denied everything, but when shown the photo of Megan's bracelet and the license plate, his demeanor cracked. "I just drove them," he muttered. Branford said it was part of a job. "You drove the children?" Marston asked. "No," Dorsey said quickly. "Just gear, bags, supplies. But I knew something wasn't right." Harwood pressed. "Why didn't you say anything?" Dorsey stared past them, voice hollow. "Because I didn't want to know the truth." He wasn't charged. His role, while morally revolting, didn't rise to criminal liability without direct evidence of contact. But he'd been part of it. A cog in a system that allowed 2 children to vanish. The DA's office prepared charges against Ernie Brome for obstruction of justice evidence concealment and interference with a missing persons investigation. He was arraigned quietly without press. Elmridge tried to keep it quiet, but the story couldn't be hidden anymore. 2 children had vanished under the town's nose. One had screamed in silence behind a basement wall. The other had been buried in a forest that parents now hurried their children past. The case that haunted a town for nearly 30 years had finally broken open. But closure felt distant. The town of Elmridge didn't know how to grieve what it had denied for decades. The discovery of the Whitmore twins' remains had cracked something open, an old wound that festered quietly beneath the surface, now bled in public. Memorials sprung up overnight. Flowers, stuffed animals, and candles lined the sidewalk near the now defunct school building. The local pastor held a candlelight vigil on the courthouse lawn. People who hadn't spoken the children's names in years now said them with reverence, guilt, and tears. Lisa Whitmore stood silently at the edge of the crowd that night, her face lit by flickering candlelight. Her hands clasped tightly around the last photograph she ever took of Daniel and Megan. It was from the morning before their disappearance, both kids in matching windbreakers smiling beside their bikes. She hadn't spoken publicly since the press swarmed her house after the discovery, but the weight in her chest wouldn't let her stay silent anymore. She stepped forward, stood beside the podium, and looked out at the sea of faces. "For 28 years, she said softly, I woke up every morning wondering if they were cold, hungry, alive. And I went to sleep every night hearing their voices in my dreams." The crowd fell silent. "I blame myself. I blame my husband. I blamed every person who knocked on my door with a flashlight and left without answers. But I never blamed the town. Because I thought you were with me." She paused. "I see now that grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides. It makes you look away. But tonight, you looked back. And that matters." Someone began to cry quietly. Another person bowed their head. "I'll never get my children back," she said. "But I hope this town never forgets them again." The silence that followed was complete, and then a ripple of clapping began. Not loud, not intrusive, just a slow, steady swell of shared sorrow and solidarity. The next morning, police returned to the orchard site with construction crews and archaeologists. The goal now was total excavation, not just for evidence but for the sake of history. The foundation of the building was carefully deconstructed, revealing 2 additional sealed crawl spaces and a rusted vent system large enough for a child to crawl through. They found old candy wrappers, a cracked thermos, and a child's drawing on notebook paper, showing a house with 2 smiling kids in front of it. The name Megan was written in the corner in large, loopy cursive. Harwood had it laminated and returned to Lisa. In the meantime, Ernie Brome remained in county lockup, awaiting a preliminary hearing. Prosecutors were careful, public sentiment was complicated. Some wanted harsh punishment. Others saw a broken man racked with guilt. His defense attorney argued for leniency, citing mental instability, grief, and the fact that he'd come forward voluntarily once confronted. But the court saw it differently. On the 3rd day of hearings, Harwood took the stand to read from Brome's own confession. "I could have saved them. I chose not to." That line sealed it. He was sentenced to 8 years for obstruction and evidence tampering. He would likely serve less given his age and health. But the record would remain his silence officially marked as betrayal. In private, Harwood wrestled with the weight of it all. It wasn't justice. Not really. It was accountability, maybe a thin substitute. But she couldn't help feeling like more shadows lingered just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Then came the final puzzle piece. A woman named Marina Alcott, who had once worked as a secretary for the Elmridge District Board, reached out with something she found in her attic, a ledger. It contained Branford's signature signed in 1995, 3 months before the children vanished for a supply requisition. He'd ordered heavy-duty locks, nails, and drywall from a local hardware store. The listed destination, Maintenance Orchard Basement. The order had never been fulfilled officially, but the ledger showed it had been marked received. The signature beside it, Franklin Latch, the very man who bought the orchard property in 1992 and claimed to have never stepped foot inside. He'd lied. Harwood and Marston arrived at his gated property late one evening. Latch was reclusive, eccentric, but not senile. When presented with the ledger, his face went pale. "I just signed what they told me to," he said. "I didn't know what it was for." "But you were there," Harwood said. "You let Branford operate on your land. You knew what that building was." He said nothing. They didn't have enough to charge him, not then, but the renewed scrutiny sparked a full-scale audit of Elmridge's property records. More inconsistencies appeared. More names came up. People had looked away, yes, but some had knowingly done worse. Still, there was something cleansing in the confrontation. The fear that had kept the town paralyzed for decades was unraveling. People were naming what they had ignored. And in doing so, they were honoring the Whitmore children more than any statue or plaque could. Lisa decided not to move away. "They were taken from here," she told reporters. "I won't let their memory be." A scholarship fund was created in Daniel and Megan's name for students interested in social work and criminal justice. On the edge of Hollow Creek Trail, near the site where the oak tree fell, a bench was installed, carved into the wood. "We were here, and we are still here." Spring gave way to summer in Elmridge, but the warmth didn't erase the chill that lingered. For the first time in years, the town buzzed with more than just gossip and weekend soccer games. It buzzed with reckoning. Detective Harwood continued working the case even after the remains were laid to rest. She wasn't ready to close the file. There were still gaps, unanswered questions, and most of all, a pattern she couldn't ignore. Her instincts told her the Whitmore case wasn't isolated. So she went back past the Whitmore file, past Branford's employment record, into every unresolved child disappearance from the 3-county area going back 50 years. That's when she found the Wendell girl. She was 9 when she vanished in 1982 while walking to a piano lesson 2 towns over. Official reports listed her as presumed runaway, but there were no signs of intention, no packed bags, no family issues, and no leads. The trail went cold in days. But one detail stood out. Her teacher at the time, Walter Branford's sister, Lenora. Harwood sat with that name. Lenora Branford. She'd lived in Elmridge until 1994, then moved to Oregon. A record search revealed she died in 2007. No family, no children, no criminal history. But something about it felt wrong. Digging deeper, Harwood tracked down Lenora's former neighbor, a woman named Dorothy Glenn, who still lived in the same white brick house with the yellow mailbox on Finch Street. Dorothy remembered Lenora as quiet, odd, kept to herself. But what struck her most was a single story she'd never shared with anyone until now. "I once saw her burning dolls in her backyard," Dorothy said. "Realistic ones, looked homemade. Tiny shoes, too. Like she'd made them." Harwood's stomach turned. It was circumstantial, but it fed the suspicion that the Whitmore twins hadn't been the first, and maybe not the last. Her investigation took another turn. when the lab results returned from the orchard cellar's wall etchings. Faint markings beneath the children's drawings had been discovered under UV light. Names, dozens of them, scratched into the cinder block in tiny, nervous handwriting, some barely legible. A partial list emerged: Amelia J., Brian C., Sadie R., Tommy P. None of these names appeared in the Whitmore case file, nor did they match Elmridge school rosters from the 1990s. But 3 did match missing children cases from surrounding counties. That's when Harwood realized the cellar wasn't just a hiding place. It was a holding site, possibly used more than once, possibly used by multiple people. She pushed for a multi-agency task force. The state sent agents. The FBI agreed to review the markings and compare them to national missing children databases. The theory emerged: Branford had been part of something larger, something networked. He wasn't just a disturbed loner. He was a cog, a local facilitator in a wider, likely underground system. There had been rumors for years about trafficking routes through the old mining roads and unused railway lines across rural Pennsylvania. Harwood now believed the Whitmore case may have been an interrupted handoff. Something went wrong, Branford disappeared or panicked, and the children were trapped. That explained the chaotic staging, the folded blankets, the cryptic "we're going home" note. Maybe they tried to escape. Maybe someone let them go and then changed their mind. Meanwhile, media interest exploded. True crime podcasts dissected every detail of the investigation. National outlets ran documentaries. Online sleuths uncovered Branford's distant cousin, a man arrested in 1999 for child endangerment in Ohio. Connections piled up, but not all attention was helpful. Harwood received threats. Locals accused her of dragging up ghosts and making the town look bad. Through it all, Lisa Whitmore stayed silent. Until one afternoon, she walked into the station holding a stack of drawings. "They made these," she said, laying them gently on Harwood's desk. From the week before, they disappeared. One showed a house on a hill surrounded by pine trees. Another, more troubling, a man with thick glasses holding 2 stick figures by the hands. "Daniel drew this," she said. "I thought it was just imagination." Harwood studied the face. Branford's glasses were unmistakable. Then Lisa unfolded one last page, torn and half-finished. This one showed a small cellar. 2 children behind bars. Above them, a shape that looked like a bird. Harwood frowned. "A bird." Lisa shook her head. "That's not a bird. That's how Daniel drew a key. The bronze key in Megan's backpack. It was never random. It was meant to be found. Daniel and Megan had left a trail. They'd left clues no one noticed, because no one wanted to look hard enough. But someone was looking now, and the truth was finally surfacing, not in one clean confession, but in layers etched into brick, hidden under roots, wrapped in guilt and silence and time. The story of 2 missing children had become the story of an entire town, a town complicit in forgetting, and a detective who refused to. The task force assembled in a makeshift command center inside the old Elmridge Community Gymnasium. Now a hive of buzzing monitors, open files, and red-markered maps pinned to bulletin boards. Harwood stood in front of a projected list of names recovered from the cellar walls. 27 in total. 4 confirmed as historical missing persons. 8 more still pending verification. The rest unknown, possibly aliases or misremembered spellings by terrified children. This wasn't a one-time thing, she said to the room of agents, troopers, and analysts. It was systematic, possibly cyclical. A murmur ran through the room. Branford may have been the center here, but we have evidence this extended beyond Elmridge. It's possible children were being held temporarily, then transported. Some may have never been reported missing. The key evidence, both literal and figurative, was still Megan's bronze key. FBI forensic techs had traced it back to a defunct line of padlocks manufactured by a regional company that had provided security systems for schools, community centers, and even group homes between 1978 and 1986. Most customers were local, but one stood out. Willow Glen Rehabilitation Center shuttered in 1989 after reports of abuse mismanagement and the unexplained disappearance of 3 juvenile wards. It was located 60 miles from Elmridge. The building had been repurposed several times, most recently as a salvage warehouse, but Harwood got a search warrant anyway. She took Marston and 2 agents with her. The building had a haunted feel, echoes of lives once lived behind boarded windows and echoing stairwells. Mold crept along the lower walls. Some rooms still held crumbling bunk beds and peeling institutional wallpaper with cartoon animals, but it was the basement that made her breath catch. There, behind a fake utility panel, they found another room, this one sealed with the exact same type of padlock the bronze key would have opened. Inside were dusty files ledgers and a steel cabinet filled with VHS tapes, each labeled by date. The tapes revealed dimly lit footage of rooms, children pacing, crying, being led in and out. No explicit abuse was shown, but the implication was harrowing. These were records, inventories, surveillance of people treated as property. The most recent tape was dated July 6, 1996. 4 days before Megan and Daniel Whitmore vanished, the FBI launched a parallel investigation, a multi-state operation. They uncovered references to handlers' routes and names that turned up in other cold cases spanning 3 decades. A criminal enterprise long dormant or long hidden was unraveling, but in Elmridge, closure still meant something smaller. Lisa Whitmore was granted a private moment inside the basement room, where her children had once been held. Harwood accompanied her. The room had been emptied of evidence, but not of weight. It still felt heavy with memory. Lisa sat on the floor. Her hands trembled as she ran them along the wall where her children had drawn. She stopped at the words, "We were here. I used to dream they were somewhere warm," she whispered, "with someone kind." Harwood sat beside her. They had each other. "That matters," Lisa nodded slowly. "Yes, it does." Plans began to memorialize the site. Not with erasure, but with transparency. The community voted to turn the Hollow Orchard ruins into a memorial garden and educational center on child protection and trauma awareness. A place where truth would be rooted into the earth as firmly as the tree that had concealed the twins' belongings. Ernie Brome's sentencing came and went with little fanfare. He accepted his punishment quietly, but never gave further names. Whether he truly didn't know or simply chose to carry his guilt to the grave remained uncertain. But others began to come forward. A former maintenance worker in a nearby district remembered being offered money for after-hours cleanup in the 90s. A retired bus driver vaguely recalled dropping Branford and 2 unnamed children off near the state forest. None had spoken up, assuming what they saw wasn't what they saw. Now they did. Marston approached Harwood one afternoon with an envelope in hand. "This came for you." Inside was a child's drawing, 2 stick figures on bikes, a sun with a face. The words, "Thank you," scrawled beneath it. No return address. She stared at it for a long time before slipping it into her desk. Weeks later, a mass gravesite was uncovered in a remote part of the state forest. The forensics team confirmed at least 5 children had been buried there, none matching the Whitmore twins, confirming again that their resting place had already been found. Still, it told the same story. Elmridge hadn't just failed 2 children. It had failed many. But it was no longer failing in silence. The final piece came on a rainy afternoon when a letter arrived at the precinct. Handwritten, untraceable, but familiar. I was one of them. A name on that wall. I escaped. I changed my name. I built a new life. But I never forgot. I want you to know someone survived. Thank you for remembering us. Jay. Harwood smiled faintly. She didn't need to know who Jay was. She just needed to know they existed. And that remembering mattered. Fall returned to Elmridge with quiet winds and golden leaves drifting across the steps of the rebuilt memorial garden. The ruins of Hollow Orchard had been cleared away, and in their place stood a peaceful grove of birch trees and wildflowers. In the center, a circular stone bench inscribed with the names of Megan and Daniel Whitmore, and a plaque with 23 other initials taken from the scratched markings in the cellar walls. For the ones we lost, for the ones we failed, for the ones who survived. Detective Harwood stood beneath one of the young birch trees, watching as Lisa Whitmore gently tied 2 ribbons around its trunk, one blue, one purple. Daniel's favorite color. Megan's favorite too. No speeches today. Just a quiet personal moment between a mother and the space that had nearly swallowed her children's memory. Marston joined her a moment later, hands in his coat pockets. Feels different now, doesn't it? Harwood nodded. It's quieter, but not silent. News of the multi-state investigation had broken wide by then. Arrests were made. A former youth counselor in New Jersey, a logistics contractor in Ohio, a man who ran a rural delivery company in Tennessee, all connected through decades-old documents uncovered in the Willow Glen basement. The reach of the network stunned investigators, even as they knew they were still scratching the surface. The full scale might never be known. But they had pierced the darkness. Harwood had turned in her request for a leave of absence the week before. Not retirement, just time. To breathe, to think, to walk through her own past and future. Marston had promised to hold the fort. As they walked the garden paths, they passed a small group of elementary students on a field trip. A young boy stopped looking up at Harwood's badge. "Did you catch the bad guys?" he asked. Harwood smiled gently. "We found the truth. That was the most important part." The boy nodded, solemn and wide-eyed. The wind picked up, then carrying the scent of damp earth and falling leaves. Somewhere a bell rang, the sound of the school day ending. Lisa remained by the tree. She had told the press she wouldn't move, that Elmridge was her family's soil, no matter how painful. She had begun attending advocacy events pushing for legislative reform around cold case investigations and database integration for missing children across states. A woman who had once refused to speak was now making others listen. As for the remaining open cases linked to the names on the wall, Harwood knew they might never all be solved. But she also knew this Elmridge was no longer a town that looked away. The final report on the Whitmore case, signed and sealed, listed the cause of death for both children as undetermined but consistent with prolonged confinement and abandonment. It didn't speak to intention. It didn't speak to suffering. But the memorial garden did. Each flower that bloomed, each ribbon tied, each whispered story told at the bench, it all added weight to their memory. And that mattered. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the grass, Harwood stood quietly, letting herself feel everything at once: sorrow, relief, regret, pride. Then she walked back to her car, started the engine, and drove out of town, past the orchard, past the trailhead, past the house with the porch that collapsed, past all the places that had once held secrets. Now they held something else: remembrance. The disappearance of twins. Daniel and Megan Whitmore in 1996 devastated their small town and remained unsolved for 28 years. A collapsed oak tree and a pair of buried backpacks reopened the case, leading Detective Harwood and her partner Marston to a hidden basement beneath the ruins of Hollow Orchard Elementary. There they uncovered a sealed room and chilling artifacts that pointed to systematic child trafficking implicating former janitor Walter Branford and others in a wider network of abductions across several states. The investigation revealed that Elmridge had unknowingly harbored more than just one horror. Branford's cellar walls bore the etched names of other missing children. Through dogged investigation interviews and forensic breakthroughs, the team uncovered remains recordings and witnesses that traced the network through old institutions and secret drop points. Though justice was incomplete, many accomplices long gone or unidentified, the truth emerged, and the town began to heal. The Whitmore children were laid to rest, and a memorial garden now stands in their honor alongside the unknown and the forgotten. Through Lisa Whitmore's resilience and Harwood's persistence, silence turned to remembrance. Elmridge will never be the same, but it will never forget again.